Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As you're thinking about boosting your nutrition, trying to get that better body as you get older, the best thing to do is try to get back to the source of the right nutrition that makes you just really, really thrive, especially when it comes to natural foods. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of the book Microgreen Garden. He's going to be talking about the value of microgreens and what they can do for us when it comes to really improving our health. I'd like to welcome the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Mark Matthew Bronstein. Mark, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
And thank you for having me, Daniel.
Microgreens, what a lot of fun this sounds like. Tell us how you got started and went this direction with your life.
Well, I'd have to say it began in 1966 when I first became a vegetarian, and then 1970 when I first became a vegan, long before anyone else at that time even knew what the word meant or heard its even pronunciation. And then during the next several years, and then during the 1970s, I think a lot of people at that time became very aware of the whole concept of natural foods, as did I. And I soon began investigating raw foods. 1977 was a pivotal year for me. I read Viktoria Sklevinskas's Survival in the 21st Century, and it convinced me of many aspects of raw foods that I had understood in the very scientific mathematical concepts, but that was more of a spiritual orientation. And so I became a raw foodist at that time. Stayed raw foodist for about 2-3 years. I mean, totally raw foods, and then veered off about 80% now, many years later. And I think that's only because I've found there's no real difference in my health, my diet, between 80% raw, 100% raw. So why not just be 80%? And along with that were sprouts, and then soon after, microgreens. So there's the long answer to your short question.
Well, there's always a good answer to a short question, that's for sure. Now, tell us about microgreens. People might be familiar with sprouts, but this is different, isn't it?
Yes. Sprouts have been long studied and documented for their great values nutritionally. Powerhouses might be a word you can apply to them. But microgreens are actually very recent. The word itself is only about 20 years old. It was first entered into the Oxford and English Dictionary, 1997. Before that time, we were eating similar things. We just didn't call them microgreens. We called them seedlings. And seedlings is something we all grow when we grow our own gardens. It's just the first stage. It's a stage beyond a sprout. A sprout is take a seed, add warmth, and water. That's really about all you need. Of course, oxygen in the air. But microgreens need sunlight and soil. And so you do have the two added ingredients, which makes it a stage beyond sprouts. Sprouts generally 1 to 4 or 5 days, and you've got your sprout ready to eat. Microgreens is more like 1 week to 2.5 weeks would be the general time frame for harvesting them.
Now, it's interesting. Why should a person be compelled, to go in this direction to use microgreens and bring them into their diet?
Well, I think there's a general tendency in our society to try to bring things home, bring things, if not indoors, at least in our backyards, our gardens. Many people are gardening now today that never even thought of it years ago. And many of us don't have yards. We just, we have our windowsills. And even if we have yards, as do I, for instance, which abuts a big woodland, I can't really grow a vegetable garden in my yard because I have too many wild animals I have to compete with. So I sort of gave up on that. And I do all my gardening indoors because of that, both sprouts and microgreens. I'm able to, actually I do have a cold frame on my deck, but that's protected too. So it's really a matter of practicality, being able to grow vegetables at home and have them as fresh as can be, better than what you would ever buy, and even organic produce from your local health food store. It's still going to be picked at least the day before. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us about the nutritional density of microgreens, because this here was something that really surprised me.
Well, as I mentioned, sprouts have been long studied and documented, probably for about 5,000 years since we first began eating foods and writing about them. That began with Chinese medical texts at the time. Microgreens have only been studied in a very rigorous scientific way only once, which is kind of strange. They are new. And that was just less than 8-9 years ago. The University of Maryland USDA lab did a study where they actually shipped 25 commercial microgreens. When I say shipped, from a microgreen producer in California, in San Diego, and they shipped them overnight to Maryland. Well, first of all, that's not going to be the same sort of microgreen you might even buy in your local produce store, because those are not going to be shipped, 3,000 miles, even though overnight. But better than that is you can grow microgreens yourself, and there's no shipping involved except from your kitchen counter to your dining room table. So you do have that control, and you do have that freshness, and the sense of satisfaction, and if nothing else, also the greater economic value of being able to grow your own.
I noticed that as I was at a restaurant some years back, they were actually using microgreens, but it seems they were using them more as a garnish. But in your book, you talk about, it's a lot bigger than that, and that those tend to be bland because those are more mass-produced. Tell us about that.
Okay, that's a good point. I mean, for instance, that one study that I mentioned from University of Maryland, USDA lab, they came up with figures of the most popular nutrients that you might think of, and 25 times the amount of vitamin E in a particular microgreen, red cabbage, using an example, or 6 times the vitamin C, or 200 times the vitamin A. Yeah, great, but the point is, if you're only eating it as a garnish, the difference between eating a single mouthful of, let's just say, broccoli microgreens, or broccoli even sprouts, is going to be the same whether you ate a whole plateful of full-grown broccoli. So, quantity is indeed something you have to look at, and I'm only using it as a garnish. It's going to be just more like having a supplement rather than, a real boost to your nutritional profile. One major difference, however, and that's a very important one, most of the nutrients, the phytonutrients especially, that are studied in these different calculations, when you're eating this as a microgreen, you're eating it raw. No one really cooks microgreens. They're too tender. They turn to mush. Okay, whereas comparing it to, let's say, full-grown broccoli, a whole plateful, that's cooked. And many of the phytonutrients do lose their nutritional value when they're cooked. Not all, but many. So one great advantage of a microgreen is you are eating it raw, and you are eating it completely fresh. So there's not that loss of nutrients during the transportation and the storage process, as usually would the case of any other food you might be eating, including full-grown broccoli, from your farmer's market. So it's all just, bring it all indoors, bring it all home, really.
I know, it was really interesting. Some months back, I interviewed a gentleman who produced a small series of books called The Kitchen Sink Farmer.
Oh, yeah, I know his books, yeah.
A lot of fun to read that, and you realize, my goodness, you can really create a sustainable, edible garden within your one-bedroom apartment. It was pretty amazing what he was coming up with there. But one of the things that he talks about that I know generally tends to be a concern for people, especially when it comes to those big companies like Monsanto, is finding good seeds, something that's going to continually give you reap rewards, so to speak, once you put in the effort. So tell us about the kinds of microgreens that people should consider growing, and how to select, the right kinds of seeds to be able to use.
All right. Excellent question. Well, first of all, just as an aside, the whole organic, USDA certification process, it specifies that in order to be certified organic produce, where available, the farmers should try to use organic seeds, but that's a big loophole. If not easily available, they are allowed to use non-organic seeds. So right there, you're using non-organic to start with. Not a big deal because the seed, of course, is so tiny compared to the full-grown vegetable or whatever food one might end up eating. For microgreens, the really important thing, less important than organic seeds, is non-treated seeds. All gardening seeds, unless the gardening source specifies otherwise, are treated. by treated, I mean fungicides in order to prevent molding when the seed is first exposed to moisture in the soil. And that's always a large loss of the ratio of the crops is to mold, fungus. So they're routinely treated. There are several gardening seed companies, mail order companies, that specialize in non-treated seeds, and not necessarily organic. If a gardening seed is called organic, it is by definition non-treated. So all organic seeds are not treated. However, not all non-treated seeds are organic, okay? So the important thing, if you're going to be seeking seeds to grow microgreens, is non-treated. And the main reason is you're keeping that microgreen very small, immature, 1 week, 1 week and a half, 2 weeks at most. So the proportion of that little bit of fungicide coating the surface of that seed is still relatively large compared to the microgreen itself. In contrast to the full-grown vegetable, you're starting out with a little seed and a little bit of a coating of fungicide around it, and you're ending up with a vegetable that could be, a foot-long melon or squash. So your original fungicide proportion is very slight in a full-grown vegetable. So for that reason alone, to answer your question directly, the most important factor in seeking seeds for microgreens is you must make sure it is non-treated.
That's also interesting. Now, what are some of the microgreens that you would recommend our listeners consider, at least starting out as beginners?
All right. Is it okay to mention name brands here, companies?
That's up to you, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, give them direction to go, that's for sure.
Okay. I first want to tell you I have no stake whatsoever in Johnny's Seeds. They're out of Maine, okay? They carry a book on microgreens. It's not mine. So if I'm recommending them, it's on their merits alone. It's not because I have any kind of association with them. And there are several seed companies that specialize in microgreen seeds and also specialize with their other seeds, non-treated. And Johnny's just happens to be the one when I recommend one company above others. And that's, of course, not to discount any of the others, but for listeners on the radio who are not going to be able to maybe take notes, to just remember the word Johnny's, I think, is a really easy way of directing someone to an excellent source. They do have probably the largest selection of microgreen seeds, and they do carry some that no other seed company does. So that's also another reason why I would suggest Johnny's, okay? So to start with, what seeds? Well, they do have a very large selection. And they do have, in their printed catalog, I'm not sure if the online catalog does the same, they do give you categories of the easier ones, the less growing time, and they give you another category of the longer growing ones. The shorter growing ones would be your easier ones to grow. And generally, the easier ones to grow also just happen to be the more nutritious ones. And those are the brassicas, which is a very broad category of vegetables. Used to be known as the cruciferous vegetables, or the coles, which include cabbage, radish, turnips, all the Chinese greens, bok choy, okay. Mustard even is a brassica. So those are usually easiest. So if you start with a brassica to grow at home on your own, you're pretty well off. You're pretty assured that you will be achieving success with your first batch. That's just very generally. I could specify one or two seeds in particular among the brassicas that I highly recommend for beginners, and that would be Chinese cabbage, because it's very quick and easy to grow, almost indestructible, and it actually tastes very mild among other brassicas, because that's an important factor. If it doesn't taste really good to your palate, you're not going to eat any of it. And then radish. Radish is like 5 days, and it's a microgreen, and it's the most, probably the easiest of all to grow, and it's also the most familiar to our palates, because a lot of people may not be familiar, for instance, with Chinese cabbage, but certainly everyone knows what radish tastes like. And all these microgreens that you do grow, basically they taste the same as the tiny little tender leaf as the full-grown vegetable we usually familiarize ourselves with them when we eat them. So I'd say radish and Chinese cabbage would be your two top ones to start out with.
Now, how about soil? What are some ways, I know as I was reading in your book that, when you talk or, go to choose soil, that if it says organic, you might want to dig a little bit deeper than that.
Thank you for raising that issue.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, I do have to, qualify my own statement. I'm a vegan, a very strict vegan at that. Someone can grow microgreens and still be a regular, general eater of the American diet and not be vegetarian at all. I certainly understand and sympathize with those philosophies of food. But as a vegan, when I look at the ingredients on the packages of organic soils, I am always horrified. You go to the large, big box stores, and you seek any soils there, first of all. They're always going to be only, at the very best, mediocre quality. I always recommend going to a really good gardening store. And I'm speaking to the one half of the states in this country which have medical marijuana laws, where many of them are home grows. Probably the best source of organic soils are going to be at your cannabis grow shops. I live in Connecticut. We don't have grow laws here, but right next door in Rhode Island does, and I buy my soil from a Rhode Island cannabis grow shop because they have the best. Hello?
Yep, we're still here.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. Okay, so I happen to go to my local cannabis grow shop. Not local, it's across the border in Rhode Island. They have the best quality of the organic soils. You read the ingredient in organic soils, and you get it from the big box stores, and they're always going to be what they call poultry litter. It's a very broad term, and what that means is chicken and turkey feathers and poop, with whatever else may be thrown in, including the sawdust in the bottoms of the cages, including the body parts that may fall in through the wires of the cages. And if you understand animal agriculture the way it's done in this country today, the most disease-ridden and therefore also antibiotic-laden food is in chickens and also turkeys. In fact, chickens are fed pesticides precisely so that their poop will not attract flies. Now, another big gaping hole in organic USDA laws is that you can still use fertilizer from non-organic sources and call your call your produce organic. In other words, you can use slaughterhouse pea, poop, and bone meal. All right. So I'm telling you this because if you read the packages on these organic soils from the big box stores, 99% of them are going to have poultry litter, and that's the one thing to avoid at all costs. I, of course, try to avoid slaughterhouse byproducts generally. I do allow among the organic soils that I do have on occasion tested and find work well, the sea animal derivatives such as oyster shells, clam shells. Okay, also bat guano. That's the bats themselves are not industrialized. Okay, they're basically wild. And then earthworm castings. So those will be found in organic soils, and within my very strict definition of being vegan, they also satisfy my own qualifications there. So having said all that, yes, organic soils would be the thing to choose, but if you don't have a selection of organic soils that omit the slaughterhouse byproducts, well, then just go ahead and use the non-organic ones, right? Which is what most people end up doing anyway. So.
Yeah, it's also fascinating to think about how a person can really turn things around. How much does, implementing microgreens into a person's diet, really improve their health? What kind of experiences have you or others had that they've shared with you?
Okay. I'm not a good example. I've been eating, basically the same way for 30 years now, since the 1970s. When I started including microgreens and sprouts in my diet, I may have discerned some greater sense of stamina or health, but I can't be sure. I've tried all kinds of the newest, greatest buzzword supplements and things as they come on the market, and I've never seen any improvement in my health because I have to say, with perhaps some sense of egoism, and I'm already there. I'm already healthy. So when I started including microgreens more into my diet, I don't think I saw any great improvement. However, because I think my diet was pretty good already, okay, I wouldn't suggest just adding a handful or a garnish of microgreens is going to make anybody feel any healthier, but rather growing it yourself at home and eating an entire portion of your vegetables on your plate as an entire serving of microgreens. Well, there you probably might find some, increase in your health quota. We're speaking very generally. My suggestion about microgreens is to find the ones that you like to eat so that you eat them just the way they are. If you grow them yourselves, you're going to want to eat them just the way they are. You're not going to want to dilute their taste in any way that you get lost in the other foods that might be mixed with. I think that's just generally, if we cook a food ourselves, we think it tastes better than if someone else may have cooked it. If we grow a food ourselves, it's going to taste better to us too. And I think we have more respect for the food itself too if we knew all the work that goes into it when we grow it ourselves. The same thing, I think we can appreciate any food more when it's the only food that we're eating at that, that mouthful, and not to mix it in a salad or whatever. It's diluting the goodness of that particular green when it's lost amid other greens. That's just my own personal orientation on eating food. I have this term, people know about distracted driving. I have this term I call distracted eating, and I consider any eating is distracted when you're mixing too many things together in one dish, or in one mouthful for that matter. So I recommend growing the microgreens you like the taste of, and eating them just the way they are. You have a great appreciation of any food, I think, in that way.
It's just also, interesting to consider how much control a person can take in their lives when it comes to their, nutrition. I was just talking with a guest yesterday, and how often people will try to surrender. For instance, we don't want GMOs in our food, so we're going to leave it up to our government to try to change that law. And it's like, what we're talking about here is, well, you can empower yourself to do this right here, right now, without having to worry about all that nonsense. Knowing where your food actually comes from. And that's really important when you really get involved in this process here. It really, I think, changes your health just based on the fact that you're being so proactive.
Right. You're putting your own energy into something that you're going to get energy out of, so it almost multiplies for that reason.
Now, tell us some important things when it comes to getting this all going. I mean, is it difficult at first, or do people find that it's a lot easier than they thought?
I would have to confess that I think it can be difficult, certainly compared to sprouts, okay? Sprouts, you just need your kitchen sink, really. You don't need to have warmth as much, and you don't need light, you don't need soil, you don't need much of a space except a jar if you want to confine it to that small space. Microgreens are a little bit more demanding. And to start out, there's three main vessels, three main ways of growing microgreens. One would be in little pint or half-pint sized fruit containers that you could just repurpose yourself from the berries or the cherry tomatoes you buy in the produce store. And then the next step after that would be cafeteria trays, the kind that you see served in the fast food restaurants. They used to be called only cafeteria trays, and they're now called fast food trays. You can grow, and they only contain like a half an inch of soil, but that gives you much greater surface to grow in. And then beyond that, the way advanced, and they don't recommend really people to ever start out that way, is the using nursery trays, the 10 by 20 inch, about 2 inches deep. And there's one book on microgreens that's the only way they talk about it. It happened to be the first book that ever came out on the subject. And it was written by a commercial producer, and that's how they commercially produce their greens, is these 10 by 20s. They're also called nursery flats. I don't recommend people doing that at home unless you happen to have a sink that can accommodate a 20-inch nursery tray, flat, and then on the surface. And I don't know many people who have sinks that large. It's just too cumbersome otherwise. So I recommend, for starting out, you don't even have to spend any extra money on it. It's just using repurposed fruit containers. From the half pints, usually red raspberries, blackberries, or the pint size for blueberries or cherry tomatoes. So I recommend those, even better than if you went to a nursery or a gardening store and you bought pint-sized seedling containers. My major objection to those are, well, number one, you're spending extra money on something you don't need to, but really they don't have as many vents on the bottom for the ventilate, for the circulation, for the water to leak out if you overwatered, and they don't have any vents on the top lids for ventilation of air for when you're growing the microgreens on the soil. So I really find the ideal beginner's container are fruit containers, repurposed fruit containers, and I suggest putting one inside the other for the added rigidity. Okay, so you really want to put two together, and saving only one lid from the two. You only need one then. Cutting the lid off because you want to be able to separate it. So you've already got your container right there. That's your first step. Next is fill it with soil. You could use either potting soil or seedling mixes, preferably from your local gardening store. If you're really frugal and you're really very, very willing to accept challenges, you can always just go out into your yard and dig up some topsoil. But there's two major drawbacks with that. They will contain seeds for other weed things that will be growing with your microgreens. You may not want to be growing with them. They might also be introducing insects into your own home. So any potting soil or seedling mix you buy from a gardening store, they have been sterilized. People don't realize that. Nothing else is going to grow in them except the seeds you add into it, okay? So that's one advantage. And, of course, you could always go into your yard, scoop up some topsoil, and put it into your oven and bake it, but I'd say that's pretty cumbersome, and considering the amount of soil you'd be needing, it's probably not worth the effort. So I'd say buy some soil. You buy the larger the quantities, the cheaper it'll be. Okay, so you got your container, fill it with soil. Next step, thing on top of it, and I suggest for about 90 to 95% of all the microgreens, is you only place the seed on the soil. You do not bury it into the soil, okay? You place the seed on the soil very, very, very sparingly. You don't want your seeds to be touching. If you're taking a pint container, you would probably need only about a half of a teaspoon of most seeds, depends on the size of the seeds, to cover that surface, just sparingly. One of the major mistakes most beginners make is too much of a concentration of seed on that surface. Okay, so really you want to be frugal with the amount of seeds, better less than more. So you got your container, you filled it with soil, you place seeds on it. Next, spray it with water. Also, you've also added water to the soil that you get out of the package. And then you just let it, usually, most of them, just 2 or 3 days. Let it just, put the lid back on, by the way. The lid which has some ventilation holes. You need some air in, but you want the lid on to not let it dry out too much. Otherwise, if you don't put a lid on, you just put the seeds on the soil, you're going to have to be spraying it 2 or 3 times a day with a little water bottle, a spray bottle. If you put a lid on, maybe just once a day or even once every other day. So it does make it a little easier to do that way. And most of them don't need light. Some need light, or they'll have a higher concentration of the first wave of the ones that grow. But even if the ones, like for instance, basil is one that does better with light exposed to the seeds, even then the first wave might be not as great, but you're going to still get the second wave of seeds coming through. They'll be the ones that were the latecomers, because then you're going to be exposing it to light. So you don't really need light. Set it for 2 or 3 days. You're going to start to see things growing. Then you can remove the lid, expose it to soil. And one very, and I'm glad I'm mentioning it now because I should have mentioned it before, one very great benefit of using fruit containers are the vents on the bottom, because in fact, probably the major drawback for beginners when they grow microgreens at home is the issue of mold. And I don't mean the mold that because of the fungicides on the original seed, but as the microgreens are growing. When people put too many seeds in that surface, you're going to have too many microgreens growing. They're going to have the stems are going to be too dense, close to each other, and it's going to capture water in among the stems, particularly as the leaf canopy begins to grow over it. And that's going to cause mold problems. The reason why mold is going to occur is because of that added moisture. If you water from the top down, water is going to get caught among the stems. If you do bottom watering, which is to say, you take that container, you place it into a dish of water, let's say, an inch or 2 inches at the very most, deep of water. Water will then soak from the bottom up, and that's as far as it will get to the seeds. It will not go any farther, will not go up onto the stems, and you are virtually assured of no mold growth, and that is a really important thing. That's one of the major things that discourage people from growing microgreens if they try it at all, is because they get mold growth. So I think, so you've got all those things, you got it growing. You need sun, and of course light, but sun is probably your best source. If you don't have a good window source, then of course artificial light is fine. I do supplement with some artificial lighting in the wintertime. 6 is a magic number. You need minimum 6 hours of darkness and preferably 6 hours of direct sunlight. Anything more than 6 hours direct sunlight is great, but not necessarily a necessity. But I think that 6 hours is a big difference. A lot of people have windows that are, let's say, just only northern exposure. They're only going to have indirect light. That's fine. You can still grow your microgreens, but they're going to be looking stringy. They're going to be looking with, I have to say, pallid and not as beautiful and dense, dark, deep green as you want to seek, which with that minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight you will get. And just about, I'd say 90% of any greens you're going to be growing as microgreens, you want to give them direct sunlight. There are a few that you do not want to give direct sunlight to, but you won't have to worry about those immediately. So I think I've just given you the quick steps there.
Well, you've certainly given everybody a good reason to go and get your book. And I was going to say, for our listeners, how can people find your book, and is there a website they can go to?
Well, you can get my book from any typical booksellers, online or otherwise. You don't have to mention any names. Everyone knows the major name involved. But more importantly, you do not need to buy my book, okay? I'm not here to sell you anything. The first half of the book I put online on my website. And the first half of the book goes into just the fruit container growing of microgreens, that one of the 3 vessels I mentioned. The rest of the book, the second half of the book, not on my website, tells you about cafeteria tray gardening and the 10 by 20 nursery flat tree gardening. Plus, the second half of the book, more importantly, gives you almost like a page each for each of the different microgreens. It goes into all of the different criteria needed involved in the best growing times, the sunlight, what particular cultivar of seed to seek. Just saying someone get basil seeds is not quite sufficient. If I were to tell you, Thai basil and sweet Genovese basil are probably your best ones to start with. That's a really good starting point. So I go into, in the second half of the book, I mention all the different cultivars for the different microgreens that are preferred, and various notes on each one. But to get back, you don't need to buy my book. You can go to my website, okay? And the address for that is www.microgreengarden.com. Microgreen garden is one word. And there, as I mentioned, I put the first half of my book online. And not only that, it's actually the unedited version. So there's actually more there in that first half online than you'll find in the first half of the book that's been published. Plus, you have all of the illustrations, all the photographs which I took for the book. Most of them were printed, relatively small in the book, but online you could fill your large size computer screen with them, and you'll see a high resolution image of all those photos. So once again, it's www.microgreengarden.com.
Very good. Thank you for joining us here on the program today. It's been a pleasure.
All right, and thank you for having me.
You betcha.
All right.